As much as we may try, it is impossible to pack for every medical situation in space. For example, sanity is just as important to the well-being of an astronaut as physical well-being. The two are, unsurprisingly, often intertwined. And it should be no surprise that floating in a tin can thousands of miles from home has a psychological toll on a crew. While there are many tests and methods to diagnose and assist mental health here on Earth, space, as always, is a whole different playing field. Between astronauts underreporting symptoms in an attempt to stay airborne, and a lack of research on how the environment of space actually affects the neurocognitive functions in psychology, the field of neuropsychology among astronauts in the void is growing and evolving. So, just how are we approaching this concern for deep space travel? Today, we look at the engineering, psychological, and scientific avenues of this problem. As always, I'm Nick Saba.
And I'm Dominic Tanzillo.
Welcome to Spherical Cows. To discuss the innovations in this field, we are joined by Dr. Jay Buckey. Not only is Dr. Buckey a professor of medicine at Dartmouth's Geisel School of Medicine and an adjunct professor at the Thayer School of Engineering, but he also serves as the director of the Space Innovation Lab at the university as well.
And he was previously a NASA Columbia Space Shuttle astronaut and payload specialist. We're very excited that this is the first astronaut we have on our show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
So after flying on the Space Shuttle missions for Neuralab, it seems that you've made it your life's work investigating and overcoming the barriers of long-duration spaceflight. One could even say that you've written the book on the subject.
That's available on Kindle as well.
So now, among the many health problems presented by deep space and long-duration spaceflight, are there any that you believe are the most interesting or critical areas or intractable problems that we need to overcome and study before we send people to Mars?
Yeah, so I think one problem I think perhaps is maybe we don't talk about enough is the radiation problem. And it's here on Earth, when we talk about radiation, we tend to think about radiation in terms of cancer. So that we think of, radiation causing a risk of cancer, and that's what prevents people from being in high radiation environments. But the nature of the radiation in interplanetary space is a little bit different. And there you're worried more about galactic cosmic radiation. And so, like the radiation we worry about here, with X-rays and medical imaging and things like that, it's like high energy light. It's like photon radiation. Sort of like getting a bad sunburn.
Yeah.
Whereas a galactic cosmic ray is the nucleus of an atom traveling at really high speeds. So it's like. It's the difference between a sort of a sunburn and a gunshot wound. These things come, if they deposit energy in the body, they deposit a lot of it in sort of a tract through the body, and so then they tend to kill cells. So and where that's most important, of course, is in the brain and nervous system, where those cells may not be as easy to replace. So whereas on Earth we tend to think about radiation in terms of the risk of cancer, in interplanetary space, you need to think of radiation in terms of the loss of cells in the central nervous system over time.
Gotcha. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the story that astronauts always talk about where they're sleeping in their bunks and they see those bright white flashes from irradiated particles, I think, flashing across their corneas, that's an example of this kind of radiation that you're talking about.
That is probably what that's from, yes.
Okay. Awesome. And did you ever experience that when you were up on the shuttle?
Yeah, I had a couple of light flashes that I saw. Yeah.
That's
wild. Again, in low Earth orbit, though, you're still not that. It's only when you get out of the magnetic field of the Earth, the magnetosphere of the Earth, that you really start to then experience the full flux of galactic cosmic radiation.
Gotcha. So your specialty is in kind of neurocognitive development in the sense of you're looking at how this radiation affects neurological development, correct?
Well, actually, I wish I were doing more research on radiation. I mean, the question was, what areas do I think are very important? And
Yes.
I think the radiation isn't a very important one. It doesn't happen to be one that I'm working in right now. But we do a lot of work with neurocognitive problems, but that happens, it's more in other areas outside of space.
Well, if I may ask about that, I was looking at that research and it's very interesting. In our course, Nick and I present the necessity for these autonomous diagnosing tools, that
Hmm.
as you move further away from Earth, transmission times to and from Earth get longer and longer, so much so that, you lose first the ability to do a live call, and then even text chats would be, very delayed and difficult to undergo. And so having autonomous tools are helpful. And it seems that your lab is looking at how, in particular, auditory tests can help determine neurocognitive functioning and the progression of diseases here on Earth in both austere cases and then potentially in space. And so we would just love to hear a little bit more about where you see that tool fitting in for a long duration space flight.
Yeah, so a lot of the research we do right now has to do with how the brain's ability to process sound can provide a marker of overall brain health. And there's kind of two parts of hearing. You can break it down this way simply. One is, detecting the sounds and turning the sound into nerve signals that your brain can interpret. And then the other part of it is your brain making sense out of the sound. And you can really see your brain at work in this part of it if at a cocktail party. If you're at a cocktail party, there's all this noise around you, but you can focus on the one person that you're talking to. You can understand what they're saying. You can suppress all that other stuff, even though the person who's talking is actually at a lower level than the noise that's all around you. And that ability to focus, that ability to understand that speech and background noise is something that your brain really does. And so we've been looking at whether that ability of the brain to process, speech and background noise, or to do this what's called central auditory processing, can also be a measure of overall brain health in people who have diseases that affect the brain, like HIV, or the Zika virus infection, or have had a concussion. There are a lot of different areas that, different conditions that can affect the brain, and we're looking at see if we could use these central auditory tests to detect problems or declines in brain function. And the reason we like that is because these tests are easy to do and easy to train people to do. And they don't really depend a lot on having a lot of education or being able to solve math problems or anything like that. But that's something that it grew. That work that we're doing grew out of a space project that we had, which was really focused on hearing loss in space. When it comes to autonomy, the thing that we've been most interested in is in the psychological aspects of spaceflight, because right up there with radiation, the psychological challenges of being in an isolated and confined environment for a long period of time are really significant problems. People can do it. I mean, we've had people live together in small, isolated environments for long periods of time and do that very successfully. But it can also go very wrong. And there are things like interpersonal conflict, depression, stress, things that come up that people have to deal with on their own in the environment that they're in. Because in an isolated, confined environment, you just can't leave the environment or go talk to somebody else, or you have to kind of work it out yourself. And so one of the things that we have developed are online tools that help people be better at conflict resolution, stress management, and also we have a program for training people how to improve their mood if they're affected by depression.
And part of that, what I saw is that you frequently collaborate and work with the Dartmouth Interactive Media Lab. It's where it appears that you are utilizing virtual reality as a potential mechanism and way for people to hopefully combat some of those stressors and also potentially immerse themselves in different environments on the space capsule or space station, for example. you're probably not getting a lot of variety, and being able to put yourself in a different environment would probably be a big boon.
Yes. So the tools I talked about, these psychological training and treatment tools, are interactive media based. So they're very much focused on videos and audios to try to give you a sense of a real interaction with a person. But then what came after that is we also realized that people who live, are in isolated, confined environments don't have any experience of nature, and and people really like experiences of nature. We seek them out. People will spend thousands of dollars to go on a safari. People like going to the park, being outdoors, going on a hike. And there's this thought that being exposed to nature is restorative. That there's a theory called attention restoration theory, that just being out in nature and its ability to capture our attention just very easily, and the fact that we're very engaged and interested in what's around us, that this is restorative. And so one of the things we started to do was to see if we could provide people immersive experiences of nature by giving them VR experiences where they could be in an immersive natural environment while they were actually in an isolated, confined environment. And we haven't been able to do a big study with that, but some of the smaller studies we've done where we were in the high seas habitat. I don't know if you're familiar with high seas, but it was a habitat in Hawaii, that in an area that looks very much like the surface of Mars, but it was 6 people living in this habitat, and they could only go out, if they put on a spacesuit. And they did enjoy having that experience of being able to put on those headsets and kind of to leave the environment for a while and be in these natural settings.
And I mean, that makes sense, right? Your brain is wired to exist essentially in nature. So that's almost like a scratching post for a cat, right? Like it's something to keep your brain active and keep
Mm-hmm.
going.
Well, that's a nice analogy. Yeah, yeah, it's a good way of putting it. Yes, I mean that's the basic idea, right? That it's sort of something that's just built into us, which kind of reflects our evolutionary history.
And I'm not sure if people have recently made this analogy to you, but with the recent past half a year, MetaVerse has been quite talked about how, companies are increasingly encouraging employees and people to enter into virtual spaces for additional social interactions. That could even be helpful in combating a lot of the isolation and confinement people are experiencing on the prolonged lockdowns. And so that kind of work, I think, is especially interesting to see how it's fitting in, not just on a space mission, but also here on Earth.
Hmm. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
A question that I have that might be a little bit far afield. Currently, I'm doing some work in and about hyperbarics, and I wanted to ask about a lot of the maybe questions about, because I know you've done some work in that area as well, about the potential to customize the atmospheres for a long duration spaceflight mission. There are different ways that people are thought about tinkering with the percentage of oxygen. So, dialing those percentages up or down, whether that be on a spaceship itself or also in the spacesuits. We're always trying to maintain very specific amounts of oxygenation to combat both decompressive stress and then also to make sure that astronauts are well oxygenated. Do you have any insights, though, on talks about making these customized artificial atmospheres? For example, increasing trace amounts of hydrogen gas, not so that it becomes an explosive hazard, but to act as, for example, a reductive element in the air and combat the oxidative stress from long duration exposures in the pure oxygen spacesuits.
Huh. Well, I will say this. So the the biggest, the concern with habitats is like, so right now we're at sea level, right? And we have an atmosphere that's 21% oxygen and the remainder is nitrogen. And nitrogen's inert. So we have all this nitrogen dissolved in our body. So anytime we go into a lower pressure environment, that nitrogen wants to come out of the body. So for example, if we were to go from where we are right now at sea level up to 30,000 feet or whatever, and we did that right away, that lower pressure on the outside, so there'd be a very low pressure on the outside, but a high pressure of nitrogen on the inside, that would lead to creation of bubbles and for the potential of decompression sickness. So these bubbles would be forming. So anyway, we're saturated with nitrogen here on Earth. So that's the problem on the space station. So the space station's at sea level atmospheric pressure, so everybody's saturated with nitrogen. But if they want to go into a spacesuit, that is at just a fraction of the atmospheric pressure. So let's say I hate to use PSI, but it's what I grew up with. So let's say it's 14.7 PSI, right? People are going to go into a spacesuit that is 4.3 PSI. So that's just like taking us from sea level and going up to 30,000 feet. So they can't do that right away, because if they did that, they'd get decompression sickness. So there always has to be a process in between in order for them to get the nitrogen out of the body. Now you can see that would be impractical if you're going to have a habitat in another surface. If you made the habitat at sea level atmospheric pressure, every time anybody wanted to go outside or do anything, they're going to have to go through this process of getting all the nitrogen out of their body, and then they come back in, they load the nitrogen back on, and then they go out and they're taking the nitrogen off. So it's a real pain. How they solved this back in the day, back in the Skylab program and in the Apollo program, they kept the spacecraft it was at 5 psi, 100% oxygen. So you didn't have to do any pre-breathing or anything. You just got in the suit and you went out, because there was the nitrogen was out of the equation. There is some concern that doing that, however, is not as safe as having some inert gas in the environment. So there's thought that there should be some inert gas, and there have been workshops, on finding sort of the optimal atmosphere. How much nitrogen can you put in the atmosphere that'll keep the fire risk low, but also make going in and out of the habitat and into the spacesuit easy to do, and keep the risk of decompression sickness low. And I think it's around 8 psi. I have to go. Just looking to see. Yeah, about 8 psi, right? Is that what some people are thinking about? And if you did an 8 psi atmosphere that was about 32% oxygen, or even 100% oxygen, that would, that would be something where you could kind of strike a balance between having to, having a risk of decompression sickness, but also keeping things simple so you're not constantly denitrogenating or getting rid of nitrogen all the time.
Gotcha. Where the benefits outweigh the cost.
Exactly.
So I have two quick questions. I want to pivot back, and we know you have some engineering experience. We also know that you've talked about kind of these different issues, radiation, pressure, oxygen. What are some of these engineering solutions that could be created, improved, or added in order to help not just physical health of astronauts, but also their mental health and neurocognitive development as well?
Yeah, so technology. So, I mean, we obviously like the idea of the interactive training, and the idea there is that's based on the idea that people can train themselves to be better at things like conflict resolution and stress management. I mean, we all know from our own lives that some people are better at certain things than others, right? But we can all train and be better. So that's the underlying notion there. The other technology that I think would be great to see more work on is that there's some controversy about is the idea of active radiation shielding. So there's all this galactic radiation flying around in space. How come we don't worry about it here on Earth? And well, we don't worry about it here on Earth because of two things. One is that there's a magnetic field around the Earth which tends to deflect this radiation. And then also the atmosphere does also help to reduce it because it creates a certain amount of interactions with the galactic cosmic rays before they end up hitting the ground. So that's why our life evolved without worrying about galactic cosmic radiation all the time. So if the magnetic field of the Earth is such a great thing for keeping galactic cosmic radiation at a reasonable level, well, why couldn't we put a magnetic field around the spacecraft? And this is an idea that's certainly not new. You can go back. There's a popular science article from the early '60s by Werner von Braun that was
Oh, no way.
that shows a toroidal spacecraft that had a magnetic field around it. But of course, back then the idea was a little bit pie in the sky because the energy to do that, just didn't seem to. Where would that come from? And also
Yeah.
creating a magnet of that strength, with the technology they had at that time was really difficult to do. But now with high temperature superconductors, our ability to create magnetic fields has really improved. With MR scanners. I mean, and now there's some indication that perhaps fusion is going to be advanced because there are better high temperature superconductors, which will allow for a cheaper and better technology to try to contain the reaction, which is always done with these complex magnetic fields. So we're getting a lot of experience in using magnetic fields. We have more high temperature superconductors, and so maybe this is the time to start maybe looking at active shielding a little bit more in more detail, and that would be a good thing, I think, because I think that radiation is probably more of an engineering problem than a medical problem.
Gotcha.
So it's one thing to give people different things that might help with photon radiation. Like you can protect yourself from that fairly easily with shielding, or you can take certain compounds that might minimize the damage that you get from it or enhance the DNA damage. But there's not much you can do to prevent killing of cells,
Yeah.
So, it's like giving vitamins to treat a gunshot wound. It's like,
Yeah.
it's just a different thing. It just doesn't work that way. So I think that would be a technology that would be very interested in seeing more work on.
That's fascinating. I find a lot of your research fascinating, and I love how it covers a bunch of different fields like the auditory tests and all of this important stuff. I do want to try to pivot here in these last 5 minutes to kind of our question of the show, which is, do you have any advice for people that are interested in your field? And I would love if you would kind of talk a little bit about your personal story and getting to where you are right now, or getting to be an astronaut and then landing in the research sector. How did you get there? Do you have any advice for someone that's trying to kind of follow your footsteps?
No, I was as an undergraduate, I was in electrical engineering. I was an electrical engineering major, and then I went to medical school, and then I was doing training in internal medicine. And it was really when I was doing training internal medicine that I started looking ahead and saying, hey, well, where am I headed? What am I looking towards doing? And at that time, I started realizing that I really liked the space program. It was something that was a real motivation for me when I was a kid. And I sort of realized, well, if I like it so much, why am I not doing anything in that area, right? So so that's when I started looking around for labs that were working with the space program or had projects going on. And so I did some research, sent letters out, and one of the people who got the letter knew someone at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center who had projects, starting projects on the cardiovascular effects of weightlessness. And they invited me there for an interview. I went down, interviewed, and started off as a NASA space biology fellow.
No way.
At the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. And I have to say, I did that right after my internship at medicine, and people thought I was nuts. So, but the thing is that it is what I wanted to do. And I think, as we all know, you only go around once. So you ought to, if it is a passion of yours, you should start looking and thinking, well, what is my passion? What is my interest? And how would I go about, doing that? So I started in the cardiovascular area, and we did a lot of work. We measured central venous pressure in space, which is the first invasive measurement made in the space program, which had interesting results that we still talk about today. And then I was an alternate payload specialist for the Space Lab Life Sciences 2 flight. I didn't fly in that mission, but I did the training. And then I was a payload specialist and flew in space on the NeuroLab mission, which was a 16-day mission totally devoted to studying the brain and nervous system and how it, adapts to weightlessness and then readapts to being on Earth. And so I think my background in engineering helped, and obviously background in medicine helped, background in research helped. But I think the main thing was that I just said, hey, I want to go do this. And I just started looking for opportunities.
Well, that's awesome.
Wonderful. Additionally, is there any place that people can look to find you, your resources, your book, for example, anything that you'd like to tell audiences about?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the book is available on Amazon and other booksellers. And it's called Space Physiology. And it's basically goes through it's a sort of little handbook about space physiology, covering a lot of the areas we talked about here.
We will post the link for that as well with the episode here. Are there any particular programs for students trying to pursue this path that you could highlight?
Well, I don't know, but I will say there's been a tremendous, great interest in a lot of schools, forming medical students in particular. I've been seeing a lot of medical schools forming space medicine interest groups, so it's really growing.
Absolutely. Dominic and I are always fans of the growing interest in space. So I think we're at time here. Dr. Buckey, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on and recording with us.
Thank you. Great talking with you both. All right.
We always like to tell the audience and remind them to stay oxygenated.
Yes, stay oxygenated.
Stay oxygenated, everyone.